Welcome to the Advisor's Corner. My name is Hector Garcia. I'm an accountant and a business consultant. From time to time, I interview thought leaders, industry experts, subject matter experts, and other folks helping business and small business grow throughout America. Today is no exception. I am interviewing James Carbary, and I'm going to allow James to introduce himself. He's an expert in marketing, particularly in the world of podcasts. And we'll have an open discussion about why podcasts are so popular now. Why are they such an effective marketing tool and a thought leadership tool for any business advisor or business consultant? Anyone working in the business to business space should heavily look into podcasts. I mean, there's a lot of things out there. There's YouTube videos, there's social media, there's webinars, but I like to specifically hone down in podcasts and kind of compare them with other things that are out there in terms of thought leadership and marketing. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Hector. How are you?
Hey, James. So, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, about the company that you founded, and kind of the projects that you're working on now?
Yeah, Hector. So I had kind of an untraditional path, I guess, to entrepreneurship. So I started, shortly out of college doing helicopter logistics for NASCAR, as random as that is. And so did that for about 3 years. And that was really my first time ever working for an entrepreneur. And so I didn't even know what the word meant until I worked for this guy, Jeff, at his company. And he asked me to step into a role where I was managing all of the helicopter operations for a line of his business. And so did that for about 3 years and really saw, Jeff run a business from the perspective of, being right next to him in a lot of his decisions that he made and a lot of the ways that he operated the business. And I thought, man, I think I could do this too. And so decided to kind of forge my own path into it and started a technology company that didn't work out. And then started this agency a little over 2 years ago now. And we've, pivoted our model a little bit since we first started, but in about a year and a half ago, we really landed on the model that we're currently in where we produce podcasts for B2B brands. And so that's really kind of the niche that we've dug. And so we do a daily podcast ourselves called B2B Growth Show, where we interview, B2B marketing leaders every single day. And then we also produce several podcasts for different clients in different industries. So that's a little bit about my background.
Awesome. And that's kind of how I found you. I become a podcast junkie in the past couple of years. And mainly is because I'm the type of person that's always thinking about something. And I like to channel my brain to think about something, let's call it productive, right? And productive thought for me in terms of business, it's anything that's a discussion about strategy, better pricing, marketing, relationship building, all those things. I mean, other than all those things, when I'm thinking of, let's call it my idle time, I'm doing basically accounting work. But I do a lot of driving. I drive to different clients' offices and things like that, and I'm doing a little bit of exercising and jogging and walking at night. And these are situations in which actively listening to something, and not looking at a screen, not looking at a video, it's the right thing for me. And in some cases, I listen while I work, and that could be a little distracting as well. But I become a kind of a podcast junkie, and I'm always looking for different things. And I ran into a podcast series called Best of Business, I believe is what it's called. Best of Business. And I saw that Best of Business was most of them, the common denominator was you were in it, or maybe you introduced it. And I figured, wait a second, how does one podcast that's Best of Business have the same person, different podcasts? And then I dug into you, and you're like, well, you're helping all these people produce these podcasts. So I thought that was very interesting, and we exchanged some emails back and forth, and I looked at some of the podcasts you're producing, And I'm telling you, they're really high quality, and I love the content. I'm a content person. So do you mind
Right.
telling us a little bit about maybe, I mean, I know it's going to be hard to pick favorites, but for the sake of time, pick a couple from the ones you're producing that you're really excited about, and talk to us about the content itself.
Yeah, yeah. So we're actually just about to start producing a show for a company called Inside View that I'm really excited about. Inside View is a really dominant name in the sales and marketing space. They're a data provider, and so they've got a really strong brand. We're really excited to launch a show for them. Haven't launched it just yet, so I can't speak to too many details. We've got a show that we produce for a digital agency in Southern California. They're talking to a lot of folks in the e-commerce space, and so talking to CMOs and different marketing executives at some pretty large brands. I think we did an episode several months ago with someone from eBay on that show that just ended up being just incredible content. And so, I mean, there's obviously, I don't want to talk too much about the shows that we're producing, because I think podcasting in general is blowing up, and there's so many incredible shows out there that we don't have anything to do with. And so, a couple of those, I'll just kind of open up my podcast app real quick, Hector, and tell you, what are some of the ones that I'm currently kind of binging on right now.
Yep.
I'm a huge Gary Vaynerchuk fan, and so he's going all in with his podcast this year. It's called the Gary V Audio Experience.
Yep.
And so that podcast has been incredible. The guys over at Drift have a podcast called Seeking Wisdom that's really, really good. Their CEO, David Cancel, and their marketing director, Dave Gearhart, just go. Sometimes they do interviews. Sometimes they just do little 10-minute, conversations with each other around specific topics. I'm really loving that show. There's a show put on by Digital Marketer called Perpetual Traffic. I'm really getting a lot of value out of that show right now. They talk, about Facebook ad campaigns and just different ways to drive traffic to your website. There's a podcast called the Marketing Book Podcast. And so Doug Burdett, he interviews different authors of marketing books.
Okay.
And shares those interviews on his podcast. So a ton of different podcasts. One that's not really business oriented. Mike Rowe, the guy from Dirty Jobs,
Yes.
has a podcast, and he does really cool stories. So I just saw that episode 46 went live, and so they're little 5-minute stories that he tells. So these are written stories that he's reading, but his voice is obviously very low voice, and you love hearing it.
He's got a great radio voice. I agree with that. Great radio voice. Yeah.
So I love that podcast. One podcast, I'll go back to one of the shows that we produce for our clients, and really the underlying thesis of why I believe podcasting is so powerful as a business. So this show is. We're working with a software company here in Orlando to produce it, and they have built a new product that is geared toward chief learning officers. So people that are overseeing the learning organization within their company, and so they started this podcast called the CLO Show. So we helped them brand the show and come up with the name and really the strategy behind it. And so they're interviewing these leaders in learning and development on their podcast. And by doing that, they were creating one-to-one, very strategic relationships with their ideal buyers. So not only are they producing this hyper-relevant content for CLOs that's going to attract CLOs to their brand just by listening to the show, the more strategic part of that show for them is actually, the people that they're interviewing on the show are their ideal clients. And so not only do they have the great content, now they've got this relationship that they can leverage to hopefully, do some business with after they do the interview. And so that was a very long-winded way to answer your question, Hector. But those are some of the podcasts that I'm jamming on right now.
Yeah, sure, awesome. Now I'm going to recommend two particular podcasts which are in my always listen list. The ones that I'm eager to see pop up in my notifications. One of them is called The Soul of Enterprise.
Okay.
And the Soul of Enterprise is it's by two guys, Ron Baker and Ed Kless, and they talk about the economy, small business. They interview different people. It's kind of a mixed match of a couple of things, but you'll love their insights. It's really, really good. It's mostly about things that affect economy in one way or the other, whether it's in a business, B2B, B2C, or even just general business. And another one is called The Art of Value. And the art of value is mostly about value pricing. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept, but lawyers, accountants, in some cases engineers, in some cases marketing folks, they traditionally charge by the hour, and it's been a very sort of long road towards getting consultants or business professionals to charge per job based on the value that you're providing.
Yeah.
And that one show called The Art of Value is 100% about that. But what's interesting about the two shows, just to say any two shows, is one of them has ads, right? It's got ad breaks, has actually radio, some sort of radio syndication. So it actually does show in some radio stations around the country. And the other one is just a straight podcast, no ads. So I think about, the business model. I think about the business model of podcasts all the time. I'm not in the podcasting business. I'm not in the marketing or advertising business. I'm an accountant. I'm a business consultant. Yet I run a podcast. And people ask me, well, what's the point? What's the business model? I put podcasts into 4 categories. One of them is entertainment.
Yep.
Okay. Just sheer entertainment. Okay. The other one is B2C sales, business to consumers. And that could also be kind of loyalty building. And that could be not just for selling, but also to maintain the loyalty on a brand to consistently sell. There's B2B, which is your area of expertise. And then the 4th category, I call it just experimental. And you got, you got these two guys talking about Seinfeld, a very popular podcast called The Seinfeld Show or something like that. Seinfeld podcast. There's no marketing. There's no advertising. There's no thought leadership happening there. They do talk about the DVD set. I assume that some people will buy the DVD set after they watch the podcast, but I don't think Seinfeld pays them for it. So I call that experimental podcasting. It's if you build it, it will come type of thing. We'll start it. We'll see what happens. So and then somewhere along the way, you can have, a podcast that is with the sheer purpose of thought leadership. And a lot of B2B podcasts that I've been listening to that have no advertising, they are thought leadership podcasts. And so I'd like to ask you, maybe in a short sentence, what exactly is thought leadership? Why does it matter? Or where's the ROI, return on investment, on doing a thought leadership type of podcast, whether it's B2B or B2C?
Yeah. So I think when you really boil down thought leadership, Hector, it comes down to content. And so if you want your ideal buyers to trust you or to trust your brand, the best way that I know to do that is to put out quality content that allows them to trust you, that allows them to see that you know what you're talking about and that you are an expert in the realm that you live in. And so that's how I think I would boil down thought leadership, and the ROI of it, is that trust. If that trust maps to revenue, which in my case it does, 100%, then there's your ROI right there. We have so many inbound leads coming in for our business because of our podcast and our thought leadership and talking to B2B marketing executives every day that, oh, these guys actually know what they're talking about. Like, they live and breathe B2B marketing. We should probably trust our brand with them if we're thinking about doing a podcast. And so, it's certainly, the ROI has certainly been there for me. And I know that a lot of the clients that we're doing podcasts for have seen it as well. So those are my thoughts on thought leadership and podcasting.
Right. And just to be clear, I listen to a lot of podcasts that I don't buy anything from. I mean, the people market, I don't buy anything from any of them, and I listen to them, and I am a target market. I am a target viewer
Yep.
for whatever that podcast is, but I still don't buy anything from them. So I think, starting a podcast thinking that you're going to sell something right away, it's probably the wrong approach.
Yep.
And also, I think starting a podcast thinking that that will be their only channel to market or establish trust and thought leadership is also the wrong approach. I mean, podcast has to be one of the weapons in your marketing arsenal. I think, I mean, in my opinion, I don't know.
Yep.
Even my podcast here, the Advisor's Corner, I still don't know what to call it. I like to talk to interesting folks. I like to learn from people that know things that I don't know, and share things that maybe we'll have conflict with, and maybe something interesting will arise from a conversation. I like to have those type of conversations, and I record them and I put them on a podcast. Now, will that translate into customers for me? I'm not sure. But if I think, in my opinion, if I have a business customer, a potential business customer that's deciding between Hector Garcia, the accountant, and whatever, John Smith, the accountant, and sees that Hector Garcia has a webinar, a podcast, active in social media, videos in YouTube, and then John Smith doesn't have any of that. I think when they weigh things in, they're like, well, some people can say, well, I'm not going to speak to Hector. He's way too busy doing so many things. He won't even help me with my accounting. And that's true. Some people have thought that, I assume. And some people probably have not bought from me because of that. And some people say, you know what? This is a person that's willing to expose what they know. They don't keep anything under their sleeves. They share their knowledge. They're proactive. They're generous with their time. And not that I'm generous with my time, but this is obviously billable time I could be charging, right? Yep. And you too. I mean, you're doing the same thing. You're sacrificing a meeting with a potential client, unless you're trying to sell to me, and we'll probably do some business in the future as well. But what I'm saying is, those are the things that I think people have to think about when you start something like this. You should think of every business, in the financial terms, return on investment, how long until we get customers from it, how many customers, we have to think in those terms. But let me ask you, since you have started a couple of podcasts and you talk to people that are probably asking those questions, talk to me about the finances, the investment, what do I get out of it? What have you learned from doing podcasts for different companies, and how you calculate the whole financial investment versus the return on investment?
Yeah. So that's a great question, Hector. So because our thesis around podcasting has so much to do with the one-to-one relationship that you're building with your guests, it's relatively easy to look at the ROI, because we're not necessarily looking and seeing and trying to attribute, hey, what lead came through to your website from the podcast? Because that's just, in reality, that's just really hard to do. But we can look and say, okay, we've produced, 30 episodes for you, and we've essentially created 30 different relationships between you and your ideal buyer, because each of those episodes featured one of your ideal buyers on the podcast. And so we look and say, hey, did any of those guests on your show turn into potential clients for you? What stage of the funnel are they at with you? Now, it's not to say that those guests are going to turn into clients the day after they do the interview. Often that's not the case at all. I've closed two of the biggest deals that we've closed in our agency this month, and they were both CMOs that I featured on the show 9-10 months ago. Right. So this is not something that happens quickly. But had I not featured them on the podcast 9 or 10 months ago, I wouldn't know them. They wouldn't know me, and I wouldn't have closed those massive deals this month with those brands because of it. So that's my thought on it is when you take in a B2B context, when you're looking at it from the perspective of, if we're doing our prospecting right, and every guest that we feature on the podcast is a potential client for us, preferably a very profitable customer for us, then we can look at the sum total of our episodes at the end of any given month and say, how many of these guests have actually turned into pipeline for us? But they're interested in what we do, and we're in conversations about how we can possibly work together. And then it becomes pretty straightforward to see, okay, we've gained this much revenue and we've spent this much producing the podcast. It's ROI positive. And so that's how we think about it here.
Right. And when you say, you interview someone that's an ideal buyer, you don't necessarily have to sell to that person you're interviewing. I mean, you may be just building a relationship, and that person could become a strategic partner where you don't sign any agreements with people. They just, maybe they're not ready to buy from you, but they know other people, that are good potential customers, and you build that relationship. You made it public. I mean, look, James, we just met not too long ago via email, and recording a podcast builds some relationship, because we're not only talking to each other and recording a video, but then later on we communicate and say, hey, how did the final product look? What do you think? Where do we edit? You do build some sort of deeper relationship that you would in just a phone conversation. And you could argue it takes a little bit longer, but not that much longer. And the other,
I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, right. And I don't think it's just quote unquote selling to the person you're talking to. Sometimes that person could be a strategic partner. Like if somebody comes along and tells me, Hector, I love your podcast, help me do it. I'm like, well, I'm not a podcast consultant. I'm an accountant. I mean, I could tell you how to record a video and put it and create an iTunes account or whatever, but you should definitely talk to a professional. So now I know someone, and you the same way. Now a QuickBooks expert, an accountant, and that sort of thing. But let's talk about specific examples. So I'm going to put you on the spot here, James. So let's say, for example, you have, let's just say, an attorney. Okay, you have an attorney that does mostly commercial litigations and wants to grow their business more heavily into business consultancy. And they're looking for small businesses all over the country to look after their services. So what would you, strategically speaking, saying, hey, if I do a podcast, what would I do? What should I do? What sort of advice would you give that person?
Yeah, so it's you mentioned a couple different things there, Hector, and I think the first thing you've got to do is get really specific with the exact type of person that looks like your most profitable buyer. And so you said they're trying to connect with people all over the country. If that's the case, that changes a lot, because a lot of attorneys work locally, and in a local context, you can start a show called, I'm in Orlando. And so, we launched a show called Orlando Success, and we feature stories of successful business owners, entrepreneurs in Orlando. It positions me to create those relationships locally. In our context, nationally for our agency, we've got customers, not just in the US, we've got customers all over the world. And so because of that, I branded the show B2B Growth. It's not local. And so I didn't want that local flair in the name. It can appeal to anybody. And so I think the same applies for the lawyer that you're talking about. For me, I know that B2B marketers are the people that are going to buy our service. So I've branded the show B2B Growth. That positions me to go out and get a VP of marketing or a CMO to be a guest on my podcast. So for that lawyer, if for them, they're trying to work with, CEOs or, executives at, small to maybe mid-market companies, then they've got to get really granular on, okay, what does that person look like? Is it specifically a CEO? Because maybe I start a podcast called The CEO Show. Or is it a CEO in a specific industry? Maybe I start a podcast called, the construction CEO, because your best customers are in the construction industry, and that you need to have a relationship with the CEO of those companies to really get them to retain your services as an attorney. So the more granular and specific you can get, I think people oftentimes, Hector, think that they have to be all things to all people, and when they start putting out content, they think that they need to be I can, but I'm an attorney. I can do things for across all industries. I don't want to just have people thinking that I just work in the construction industry, but then you just become like every other attorney.
Right.
But when you become the attorney that focuses on the construction industry, you'll notice that, that saying, there's riches in the niches, is popular for a reason, because when you become the go-to attorney in the construction industry, you start to get a heck of a lot more people coming to you than if you're just an attorney that serves everybody. So you think you're leaving money on the table, but in reality, you're actually attracting way more business to yourself because of you niching down. And I think that same principle applies to branding your podcast. The more specific and granular you can get to the particular audience that you're trying to serve, the better.
Yeah, and I think it also, I mean, just as a side topic, talk about niching, but I think it also shows up in your price. You know, like if you have a company, just I'm gonna say your industry. I'm a numbers guy, so we'll throw some numbers out there. But if there was a national company that's a podcast consulting business, and they do everything, they would probably charge a lot less that someone like you that's, I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that's specifically going for, well, B2B marketers trying to hit their specific niche audience, doing non-entertainment, only thought leadership, only interview-based podcast. So you have this, hyper specialty that you're good at, that you know how to do, that you've done it 50 times, 100 times, whatever. And then when somebody new comes to you, I think that shows up on the price, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, it does. It does, because I know that the specific result that we're trying to drive for our clients is worth our price. And so for other folks that maybe just edit audio, or that, they do other elements of podcast production, they would maybe call themselves our competitors, but they're really not, because they're not trying to deliver the very specific result that we're trying to deliver. And because I have my finger on the pulse of what that result is, I value the service much higher than what a lot of folks competing with us are valuing their service at.
Awesome. And I also wanted to kind of roll back and talk about, I know we've been talking about mostly podcasts, but compare it with what else is out there. So, when you go back 50 years, I don't know how back I could go marketing, but I mean, the most oldest marketing I can picture is Mad Men. So that's my starting point, right? So that's like when marketing started was Mad Men, right? And then everything else came forward. But when you fast forward from Mad Men, which we're talking about having a limited number of areas that you can do actual marketing on, right? People are thinking about ads, right? I mean, when people think about marketing, they think of ads. Well, I'm going to run an ad, and in the Mad Men world, that's it. It was an ad, and that's it. And then television came in, and then basically television was there, and radio has been there obviously forever. And podcast is kind of like, let's call it the comeback of radio in a digital form. And then we have social media, and then we have blogs, and then we have pay-per-click campaigns. I mean, like, the web has made marketing so complicated and so complex. So, let's talk about how podcast compares to some of maybe the more popular, the more well-known forms of marketing. So if someone's trying to compare, well, should I do webinars or should I do podcasts? I guess we can start like that. Like, what do you think about comparing webinars and podcasts?
Yeah. So, I mean, comparing webinars and podcasts are interesting. I'm trying to incorporate some things into our podcasting service to derive some of the benefit that I really see from webinar. But to me, a huge benefit of a webinar is that you collect somebody's email address. You're really gating the content behind an email address. So where a podcast is on demand, anyone can access it without handing over any of their information. So you're probably going to reach a wider group of people. But with a webinar, you can obviously collect that email and nurture that lead, hopefully, throughout your sales cycle or your sales funnel, and convert that lead into an actual buyer. Where a podcast is just it's tougher to do that. So that's one benefit of webinars. I haven't done a whole lot of webinars just because I'm so consumed with podcasts and what we're doing and really deriving the benefit there. I think the benefit of a podcast is because it's open gated, there's no email address required. I can reach a lot more people because they don't have to, there's no sacrifice of their information to consume the content. And so an example, one of the clients that we closed earlier this year came to us because I interviewed a peer of theirs and that peer shared the episode on LinkedIn. This CEO that ended up buying from us, they didn't have to give me their email address. They just, oh, my friend got interviewed on this podcast. I'll listen to it. He listens to it. Here's the episode. Is like, oh man, this is really good. Here's the ad spot where we talk about what we do as a business. Ends up reaching out to us, and now they're a really good customer of ours. So, had that been a webinar, that may not have happened, because he probably wouldn't have given his email address to consume that content. So those are just a couple differences. I think when you look more at the traditional means of marketing versus where I really see it today, and the direction of where it's going, Gary Vaynerchuk talks a lot about marketing being an interruption. Traditionally, marketers want to interrupt your behavior. So when I'm watching Hulu and it stops, at every 15 minutes to show me 15 seconds of ads or 30 seconds of ads, it's frustrating to me because it's interrupting my experience of consuming this program. And so I'm almost a little bit subconsciously angry at the Jeep running up the hill, because I don't want to see the Jeep running up the hill. I want to watch my show. And so with, that being, obviously the TV approach with TV advertising, even with Facebook ads, it can be, a similar experience where you're scrolling through, you want to see your friend's dog pictures. You don't want to, be sold to. And so it can be very interruptive. And so the brands that I'm seeing that seem to understand kind of modern marketing are transforming their brands into media companies. And so by doing that, you are actually putting out content that your buyers want to consume. You're not interrupting other behaviors, hoping that they pay attention long enough to possibly buy from you. You're actually just giving them insanely good content that they want to consume. And so by doing that, you become that kind of trusted brand that they actually like, not the brand that interrupts their behavior and that they're annoyed with every time that they see something pop up from them.
That's very interesting. I think I used to call this when my undergrad was in marketing actually. I later on became a numbers person, but I used to call this push and pull marketing. I think one of my professors kind of explained it to say, look, there's two types of marketing. There's push and pull, and then you have to figure out where you're going to be. So the way they explained it to me, which I understood perfectly, is push is, well, you want to get on somebody's face, interrupt their viewing cycle, put an ad, in the highway, cut the program every 15 minutes to run an ad. That's push, right? You're getting into their space. And then there's pull, and this is back when I did my undergrad. So this is like back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Pull, it's a little bit different. Pull is, we're only going to cater to people that are looking to buy from us, or they're looking for information that could be related to a potential sale from something that we're selling, product or service. And back then, the internet was just starting to become, big into content and ads. Google was still this infant. And in today's age, pull marketing, I find it to be the most effective, because I don't have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to get into a bunch of people's faces that are just not fit to buy from me. I just have to create content and use the famous keywords, right? The specific keywords. So when people are searching for a particular issue, they land straight to me. I mean, one thing I'll tell you, if you follow any of my work, or even if you don't, if you actually go to Google and put import Excel into QuickBooks, something super hyper niche, like I don't need to run a Super Bowl ad. Actually, a Super Bowl ad would probably be less effective, than me creating content around specifically importing Excel into QuickBooks. Because if you Google that, you will land into a video and a few blog posts that I put, and that's where a lot of my leads come from. It's one example. It's one example. Now, why don't I do a podcast about importing Excel to QuickBooks? Well, that'll probably be pretty boring. But that's what I'm saying. I mean, and you have to combine it with different things. I mean, I found this is a podcast that I don't know if I'll ever do any marketing on. if I get 100,000 listeners, I'll probably consider it. But because then I can add more resources. I mean, I'm literally doing this from my house. But but this is what I like to call an experiment into thought leadership. I'm trying to see, hey, can I share good stories or even extract good information from people like you? Let me ask you a different question, and we'll kind of wrap this up.
Yeah.
I'm an accountant, and let's say we have an accountant listening to this podcast, like me, a colleague, and they want to get into business consulting, or they want to get more consulting clients, because consulting is kind of my thing. And they go to someone like you and say, how can podcast benefit me? And the most important thing is, if I'm going to start giving away consulting advice, general business advice, am I giving away the store? Am I giving away too much? Am I not going to have anything left to give? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think that's to think that you're going to be giving away, everything in your podcast is a little crazy to me, just because the businesses that you're going to be consulting are obviously all different. They're going to be, they're just different. Even if they're all in the same industry, their backgrounds and their situations are all going to be different. And so people are hungry for good content, and they're willing to pay you for more contextual information and for your time spent. Hey, this guy seems to know what he's talking about. He seems to know his stuff. And if he works with me, he'll probably have a really good idea on how I can tackle my specific issues. And so, speaking to the accountant listening to this, again, I talk about this so much because it's so important, but really going back to, who is my ideal client? Do I specialize in working with, entrepreneurs? Yeah, manufacturing, or whatever the case may be, but getting really clear on who that is, and then thinking to yourself, how can I create content for that specific audience? And with a podcast, you can obviously go out to those specific decision makers that you're trying to sell to, and without trying to sell to them, just say, hey, I want to feature you as an expert guest on my show. Would you want to spend 30 minutes and be a guest on my podcast? You want to make sure you don't sell them at all, or try to make any, you don't even want to smell like you're trying to sell them something on that interview. That interview is just really a way for you to create great content and establish the baseline for that relationship. But as those relationships start to stack on one another, you can eventually reach out and start the conversation around what it would look like to work together, because the person now knows you. They've spent time with you. Like you said earlier, Hector, there's a lot of back and forth that goes into producing a piece of content with somebody. Hey, it's live. Here's the link. Hey, it's being downloaded this many times. Hey, maybe you bring them back on to do another interview with them, or hey, I got some listener feedback from your episode. There are several ways that you could start to nurture that relationship. But if that person is an ideal client for you and is worth a good amount of money for you over the lifetime of the relationship, if they end up doing business with you, like you said earlier, it's worth investing that time, and it's worth doing that. And so, I think the reason I harp on, the identification of who that most profitable customer is for you is because I see so many people not doing that. They think they're going to create this show that appeals to the masses, and the reality is it's going to appeal to nobody, unless you get really specific with who it should appeal to. So those are my thoughts there.
Okay, so let's summarize this. You want to, as a business consultant or any business to business service provider, you want to hone down specifically who your target customer is. Focus on the most profitable ones, whether it's a specific industry, a specific business type, a specific buyer, specific products and services, whatever. So hone that down, narrow that down. Then your next recommendation is, hey, start a podcast. Appeal to those folks, whether it is the CEO, the chief learning officer, the chief marketing officer, whatever. Try to appeal to the directors of those type of businesses by providing information that they would otherwise have to hunt down and read, or they didn't even know that they were looking for it, but your show is good enough where they're eager to learn something new and interesting.
Yep.
Build trust and relationship with those people that you're interviewing with, and hopefully somebody else from the listenership that builds trust and relationship with you as the interviewee and your guest as the interviewer and your guest as the interviewee. And focus on thought leadership. Provide new good content. No marketing. Your return investment is eventually there because people will contact you and say, "Hey, I listened to your podcast. Talk to me about what you do." Is that kind of like what you're saying?
Yeah, there's another piece to it too. I mean, with the folks that we've had on our show, they might not come to us and say, "Hey, I want to produce a podcast." It takes some proactive. It takes me presenting an offer. So that's one thing I'm learning right now as an entrepreneur is just the importance of being confident in the value that you provide to the market and being okay making that offer. What I see so many people doing though, Hector, is trying to make that offer to someone that they've added zero value to. And so when you send someone a cold email saying, "Hey, I want to be your accountant, look at my results that I've gotten for other people," or they send an 8-page email going on and on about how awesome they are,
right?
And trying to win business that way. Well, no wonder nobody's responding to that email and engaging with you. You haven't added any value to them. All you've done is brag about yourself and try to get them to buy your thing. But if you've brought them on as a guest on your show, you've allowed them to grow their personal brand. You've allowed them to look like an expert to your audience. You've had that 15, 20, 30-minute conversation with them on an interview, developing that relationship. Now they know you. You're not just some spam bot in their inbox. You're a human that they've interacted with and you've added value to them by exposing their wisdom to your audience. And so now when you come back to them, a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, in some cases months later, and say, "Hey, so-and-so is thinking about you. I really think that, we've launched a new service that I think would be a great fit for you. I'd love to chat with you about it. Are you up for it in the next couple of weeks? Do you have any availability?" Well, the likelihood of them saying yes to that now goes through the roof because they know, like, and trust you already. And so I think not just sitting back and waiting for that business to come to you, but once you have those relationships, proactively engaging those relationships in such a way where you offer your services. And if they say no, you obviously don't want to keep beating them over the head with it. If they say no, they say no. But knowing that you're likely going to get a pretty good engagement rate whenever you reach out and ask for that, then there's no reason why you shouldn't do that. To sit and wait, I think that was the mistake that I made for the first year being in this new model, is I just sat back and waited and nothing came to me. People are busy. They're thinking about a million other things. They're not thinking about your service because of a podcast they did with you, months or years ago. But they do remember you, and they will, if you email them and offer your service to them, they'll know who you are. And if your service seemingly adds value to their life, they'll engage with you, as opposed to the stranger that's emailing them trying to sell them the same thing that they don't know from Adam. They're going to ignore that guy, but they're not going to ignore you.
So build that relationship up front. Don't expect anything in return. Immediately. Add value. Once you know you added value, don't be afraid of making an offer to do something. Awesome. I appreciate it. All right, James, thank you very much. So if somebody wanted to reach to you or ask you a question or check out what you're working on, how would they do that?
Yeah, so my email is james@sweetfishmedia.com. You can find me on Twitter at James Carbary, Carbary. I'm really active on LinkedIn. Just search James Carbary. And then you can also go to sweetfishmedia.com and if podcasting is something you're looking into doing, we've got a contact form on there. Then would love to connect with you there. But I'm all over the internet, so would love to connect with anybody and everybody that has questions about this stuff. Love being a resource for folks.
Awesome, James. Thank you very much. Thank you for being on the podcast. Best of luck, and I think we'll be talking soon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely, Hector. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
Bye.